For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
I don't think that most church people have paid attention to theology through the ages. I know in the American setting best, there's a strong anti-intellectual tradition that's pretty pervasive. So theological education can be seen as a sort of luxury. Today, we're very aware of being in a global Christian situation, and there's a terrific need for global theological education. Particularly in the Protestant world and probably evangelical world, there's a tendency to free enterprise and whatever works in the market will work. And that has some benefits in bringing people into the church. But then the next stage, it seems to me that the function of theology is sort of not to be in the front lines, but to help people get more depth in their Christianity, and educational institutions are an essential way of doing that.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. A pervasive anti-intellectual tradition seems to haunt American Christianity, paired with nationalism, xenophobia, or a fear of the other, and a hypersensitive oscillation between defensiveness on one hand and jingoism and the culture war on the other. It's worth asking, what in the world happened to this religion which was founded by a peaceful, humble, homeless preacher who healed the poor, the lame, and the blind? But the overcorrection to an intellectualizing of theology, to the exclusion of lived experience, swings the pendulum back in the other erroneous direction. A merely cognitive theology that stays relevant only at abstract academic levels would be stale, dead, unlivable. Perhaps what this moment needs is a widened perspective on the global, universal potential of theology, especially as it meets particular contexts and communities in the individual human life, where the transcendent meets the immanent and real human concerns inform the theological task. In other words, theology for the life of the world. In today's conversation, Matt Crossman discusses the purpose of theology with George Marsden, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Notre Dame, and author of many books, including his celebrated biography of Jonathan Edwards, The Soul of the American University, and The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. Together, they discuss the relationship between theology and the church, the meaning of theological education in the university, the definition of human flourishing, pluralism and representation in higher education, and the danger of privilege and prejudice in Christian theological teaching. Ultimately, it's all about how theological perspectives gain plausibility in public life. Thanks for listening.
As you see it, from your particular vantage point as an historian of religion, what's right with theology? You say, what's going well in theology?
I think theology goes well largely to the degree that it's embedded in a church setting. And my main experience in theology these days is with the evangelical tradition, and theology is, I think, getting to the churches in that you have pastors and other church workers who are theologically informed. Now, we all know that theological education is declining in just the numbers of people that are going there, though I think that probably hits the mainline churches, as everything else does, more than the evangelical. And I think I taught at Notre Dame. I'm not an expert on Catholic theology, but I think Catholic theology is alive and well in lots of places. And I don't know exactly how much of the theology gets through to the Catholic constituents. And that's a problem also in any kind of theology. But if you have theologically informed clergy, that even if they're not talking about explicit theological issues at a very high level. Nonetheless, if they have a sophisticated theological understanding, that's probably getting through to some of the congregants, and you can tell that if certain churches that you go to, you can get really well-informed preaching without it seeming to be academic.
It's not a seminary lecture, but it's providing theological education to the church at large. Sure. So that's fun. What's going well? What are some of the challenges as you see it for theology presently? The particular context in which you think theology has a hard time kind of finding a place, or what are the challenges that you see?
Well, the most persistent challenge is perennial. I don't think that most church people have paid attention to theology through the ages. I know in the American setting best, there's a strong anti-intellectual tradition that's pretty pervasive, and that cashes out in a decline in belief that you really need theological education. Or maybe I shouldn't say decline, because if you go back to early Baptists and early Methodists, they didn't emphasize a lot of theological education in the first place. So theological education can be seen as a sort of luxury, and there was an era where there was in the 20th century, I think, where there's an expectation of a certain kind of style of 3-year seminary education that most clergy would have, and even the more populist denominations tended to follow that pattern. That's, I think, beginning to disappear, and there's much more simply mentoring people in churches, which could be bad, but probably not so good for theology proper as a discipline. Today, we're very aware of being in a global Christian situation, and there's a terrific need for global theological education. Also, there's a terrific opportunity there, I think, for people who want to study theology and go to other parts of the world and be involved in theological education there, because the churches are burgeoning around the world, and to have strong theological education is a good way to help keep them with some balance, because particularly in the Protestant world, and particularly in the sort of early evangelical world, there's a tendency to free enterprise, and whatever works in the market will work. And that has some benefits in bringing people into the church. But then the next stage, it seems to me that the function of theology is sort of not to be in the front lines, but to help people get more depth in their Christianity. And educational institutions are an essential way of doing that.
A way forward for theology is to orient theology around the good life and to make some sense of what theology is for in that sense. You have some reservations about that language.
My reservations are basically only that the good life can mean anything to anyone. Everyone is interested in the good life, and so it's a term, it's a sort of empty term that needs further qualification. And if you're talking about Christian theology, well, then Christian theology is about the good life, which is participating in the life of love that originates in the Trinity. And so I'd be a little happier to say something like participating in the good life, sharing in the good life, that has a sense that this is not just an individual quest for health and wealth and happiness, but is sharing in a larger community, and ultimately a community that's larger than simply a human community. And that's actually what theology is about. And just saying the good life as such doesn't seem to me to adequately capture that. And I think from people I've talked to, other people have that reservation when I've said, well, I'm going to a conference. It's about theology should be centered on the good life, and they look sort of blankly as to, well, what is that? What is that?
Yeah, no doubt. It's a formal term, yeah. And as you say, it can be given content by any number of traditions in very different ways.
Yeah.
I think part of our hope is that perhaps it gives us ways of having conversations with people who think quite differently and do come from different traditions, and would give that, but we at least would have a shared formal goal, right, in
well,
common.
Well, that would seem to me to be a rationale. It's another activity that theology can do, and that is talking to people from different traditions and interfaith, non-faith dialogues, and say, well, this could be a point of departure for saying, what does it mean for varieties of people? That seems to me to be a sub-aspect of what theology in general should do. It seems to me theology in general is designed to help guide the church. Theology is specific to particular theological, faiths and traditions. So the Christian theology is different from Islamic theology, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And so Christian theology will articulate a vision of the good life that has a particularly Christian content, maybe even will go about articulating that using particularly Christian ways of understanding doctrines of revelation and these kinds of ways of proceeding, of even conducting its own business, presumably from the very beginning formed by those sorts of commitments. Sure. You also talk about in your paper participation not just in a good life, a life that is the source is the life of love within the Trinity. We also talk about this then as participation in communities, in lived, real, material communities. That seems significant.
Yeah, well, that's why I say that theology seems to me to be done right when it's embedded in the church, meaning in a community, and it's serving a function in the community. And in Christian theology, in the body of Christ, there are different dimensions, and theology is one of many, and theologians shouldn't have illusions of that they are the most important. But it is an essential activity for and in a community to help guide a community that as humans we're limited and stumbling in many ways, and whatever the truth is, we have imperfect perceptions of it, and so you get some people who work hard at trying to refine our perceptions and refine our understanding of tradition, and that's a helpful, important activity for that community. But it's different from, I think, theology in a university setting, for instance, where you don't have given a community that has a commonality about it. So you don't have a theological starting point, and then it makes more sense to talk about, well, how do we communicate with people who differ from us, or how do we present theology in that pluralistic setting?
Would it help in the university setting if the humanities were to understand themselves as being oriented around the good life? It strikes me that's not necessarily the way the humanities see themselves right now.
If the humanities sought that, and there's a whole raft of books in the last 20 years saying what's happened to the humanities, and
what's happened to the American idea of college, even that has a lot to do with the centrality of these sorts of big questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So the humanities are on the rocks, and theology maybe can help speak to the humanities, but I'm not sure, because the humanities are defined in disciplines such as literature, where sort of everything but theology, and sometimes you think everything but the good life, or why do you read literature? Well, because it helps you understand the human condition better, something like that has declined, and you get academic kind of specialization that's interested in all sorts of specialized topics and politicized topics. So I think because the humanities are in such a decline, I'm not sure that hitching theology to the humanities is really the way to save either theology or the humanities.
Yeah, it may not be the best strategy, but it may be the only way that the university has the function that it needs to have for our society. I mean, this is part of our concern. Our question is, where are these kinds of big questions getting asked? And where are they getting asked in pluralistic, heterogeneous sorts of environments? It's a dangerous world if we only talk about the most important questions of life in homogeneous communities, I would think.
Yeah, well, I've been arguing publicly for the last 25 years universities should be more genuinely pluralistic and in the varieties of points of view that they're trying to represent, and sub-communities that they're trying to represent, minorities that they're trying to represent, that there should be substantial theological, religious points of view should be represented. But I don't see that happening. I don't think that's the direction that we're going. And particularly with respect to Christian theology, I think because Christianity was the privileged group, that there's a particular prejudice against that. And the more substantial theologically is, the more the prejudice is. So I think in principle, that's what ought to be done, that the universities ought to be encouraging the pluralism of perspectives. And so the universities that have theological schools, it would be a very good place to do that. And they still can do, actually, a theological school allows you to do it because university, as people, when I talk at Duke Divinity School, people said, "What? We have a divinity school?" But
it's right in the middle of campus.
Yeah, it's right in the middle. Well, yeah, it's easier to miss it at Yale than at Duke. So that gives you a little bit of a place to stand to do theology. But if you're at Ohio State, how do you represent a theological tradition? So I guess right now, as far as the future is concerned, I'm much more hopeful for the future church-related or educational institutions. And many of the church-related colleges and universities have been doing very well, and they have wonderful faculties that there's been many terrific people have been going into the disciplines in those places. That's one place theologically informed points of view can flourish, but it's really tough in the university, except what can happen is you simply get really good people in a university. And what I've noticed is that if someone does his or her work really well, the universities will accept it. So you get a Charles Taylor, people will pay attention. And so part of what can happen is you just get good people who have theological commitments and are embedded in some sort of church setting who can do theology and be compelling. But it seems to be very difficult to get any systemic recognition of that we need religiously informed voices in the university. And there's just a lot of people are really wary about that.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured historian George Marsden and biblical scholar Matt Crossman. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, sometimes midweek. If you're new to the show, welcome, friend. Hit subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd love your feedback. Ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts are particularly helpful, but we're just as happy to hear from you by email at faith@yale.edu. We read each comment and do our best to respond and improve the show, bringing you the people and topics that you want to hear. And if you're a regular listener, it's a huge honor that you stick with us from week to week. So I'll ask you to step up and join us. Help us share the show. Behind those 3 dots in your podcast app, there's an option to share this episode by text or email or social media. If you took a brief moment to send your favorite episode to a friend or share with the world, not only would you be supporting the show, you'd be sparking up a great conversation around stuff that matters with people that matter. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.